the last time I put on this coat was when I was talking at Daryl's eulogy. And so I'd like, if he still weighs heavy on my mind, I'd like to take a moment of silence for Daryl. Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I'm here to talk about religious practices and spirituality from a self-psychological perspective. And since I'm a relational analyst, I'm allowed to be self-disclosing. So I'd like to talk a little bit about me first and my pathway to coming here. Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. Well, I see myself as a following Methodist with Buddhist leanings. Methodism is one of many Protestant denominations, high on intent to be helpful, low on dogma, and low on the sense of the sacred. Some see it as the working class made good religion. And it was influential in the development of the Sunday school. The English elite had little interest in educating the lower classes to read and write. My first significant religious experience was when my grandfather, the roofer in the coal country, was in the hospital. I'd been told that God worked miracles. So I thought if I pray every day, he'll be okay. I prayed for a week and he died. So that left me some questions. In terms of my development, my father's job mandated many moves. I ended up as a lonely and somewhat isolated adolescent. I had always, and still do, wondered about the meaning of life. As a college sophomore, I suffered a very painful existential depression when I realized my math aptitude would not cut it for my long-standing dream of being an astrophysicist. I changed my physics major to social relations, affectionately called by some of my classmates the nuts and sluts major. I turned to a local Methodist youth group for support and guidance. It helped. And ultimately in 1967, I ended up president of the Methodist youth group for Harvard, Radcliffe, Wellesley, and MIT. Full disclosure.
Was there a lot of competition?
No. I think it collapsed 2 years later. I always wanted a seminar on premarital sex. Okay. In my graduation year, 1967, Harvard divinity students began to report their experiences of God on LSD. Amazing. Totally amazing. They didn't talk about the one person that ran naked down Mass Ave, but the ones that came were very inspired. Now, concurrently, I've taken some courses that were to presage my future research in psychophysiology, study of the brain-body relationship, typically using polygraphs and multiple EEG leads. New paragraph. I never wanted to kill anybody. The Vietnam War, and my terribly low draft number, 38 out of 365. Meant that I would be immediately conscripted after graduation, and that grim reality made medical training in psychiatry seem like the safest and most interesting harbor. I partly financed my Stanford Medical School tuition by working as a research assistant, hooking up many student subjects to polygraphs, wiring their brain to study EEG potentials, and infusing them with various drugs. A new chair of psychiatry, Mickey Stunkard, an aspiring Zen Buddhist practitioner, took us residents as disciples in training to the Mount Baldy Zen monastery overlooking LA, the same one where Leonard Cohen had studied. In spite of meditating my head off, I continually emphasized continually, and repeatedly failed my first koan. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Instead of going, I kept thinking about it, leaving the Rochi ultimately laughing at me and saying, "You think too much." Feeling chastised, I and my colleagues flew back to Stanford. After Stanford graduation in 1973, I was working as a psychiatric research associate in the psychophysiology laboratory at the VA hospital, then doing my own research on drug-altered states, yoga, meditation, hypnosis. I soaked up the emerging fascination with psychedelics and mystical experiences during the 1970s in Palo Alto, and I wanted a great adventure. I worked 2 jobs and saved money to buy a round-the-world ticket good for 1 year, and set off armed with a textbook of comparative religion that I found in a throwaway pile at Macy's, and my research findings on yoga meditation. I presented my yoga findings at several major medical centers in India and talked with their psychiatrists. In all, I visited ashrams in India, studied meditation in a monastery in Nepal, went to the Wailing Wall at the Old Temple in Jerusalem, the hypothetical site of Christ's crucifixion, and Bethlehem. I was primed for meaning and perhaps enlightenment, but failed to have any life-changing spiritual experiences. So now the main points in my talk and why I'm here. So, maybe 4 main points. Why are religious systems such a universal cultural expression across all known cultures, including prehistoric times? What is the sacred dimension common to religious systems and where might it come from? Why is religious sacrifice so common, especially human sacrifice, in historic and prehistoric times? And lastly, what psychological functions do religious systems provide from a self-psychological perspective? And why are they so helpful? So in spite of my research and travels, I am always have been stumped by the universality of religion. In my life, religion had seemed helpful, but never really essential. This was particularly true as I slipped into a more rational, secular worldview once I married, began parenting, and forced to work for a living here in Stanford. I had briefly read and noted that religions of primitive cultures could be seen as projections of the social system of the tribal culture. Primitive people were and are cast as living in conceptual worlds with a strong, vital, unquestioning sense of the magical and sacred. It was argued that their sense of the transcendent involved obvious projections of the role and power relationships from tribal structures and immediate, sometimes horrible predicaments, into the mystical and imminently experienced sacral realm. The term projection was relatively novel to me at that time, before my psychiatric training. In terms of the nature of gods, we should note that hard times may make nasty gods. We're calling the Mesopotamian mother goddess Ishtar, and other names in the Fertile Crescent, as depicted in Karen Armstrong's book. Quote, "The Earth Mother regularly dismembered consorts and enemies alike, just as corn was ground to powder and grapes crushed to unrecognizable pulp. Farming implements were depicted as weapons that wounded the earth, so farming plots became literally fields of blood. When Anat slew Mot, god of fertility, she cut him in 2 with the ritual sickle, winnowed him in a sieve, ground him in a mill, and scattered his bleeding flesh all over the fields. She adorned herself with rouge and henna, made a necklace of the hands and feet of her victims, and waded knee-deep in blood to attend the triumphal banquet. Well, those were hard times in Mesopotamia and pretty nasty projections. But why was religion so everywhere? I mean, I couldn't make sense out of it intuitively. But recently, I had an idea. What if religion was a universal experience because we all share the universal experience of being born? The ubiquitous infant-parent relationship could be the foundational element for the adult-deity relationship. It seems evident to me that the survival of newborn infants is dependent upon the discovery of a nurturing parent who provides protection. I suggest that the early infant is born in a state of worship, primed to discover his or her personal gods. Let me repeat that. The early infant is born in a state of worship, primed to discover his or her personal gods. And as I say this, I'm also aware that I would be birthed, safe, or drawn and quartered if I were in, Europe during the Middle Ages. So brain research on hemispheric lesions characterizes the right hemisphere consciousness as, quote, global, holistic, synthetic, gestalt, and rational. That's an important point. We now know that infant and toddler's consciousness is largely informed from the contribution of the right hemisphere. Left hemisphere is not engaged yet. Right hemisphere, which also receives most of the sensory inputs. George Atwood, one of the ICP gurus, characterized the child as having a special lantern consciousness, as contrasted to the flashlight consciousness of the adult. To me, our developmentally universal right hemisphere bias. They provide a magical world filled with fantasy, magic, awe to all children. That means ourselves, as the new pre-verbal world is explored. Imagine what it's like to be conscious, but not yet to form thoughts, really, or if thoughts to not yet have words to locate them, or to remember them by, That means ourselves as the new pre-verbal world is explored. And this world is populated, in my version, and sustained by personal parental gods, who hopefully provide safety through stable attachment, soothing and comfort, nourishment and protection. And a world relatively uninformed by language, just experience. Again, imagine. Only after several years of brain development do aspects of left hemisphere consciousness predominate over right hemisphere global consciousness. Then children are destined to move away from the world of awe, spirituality, and magic, in my version, to the more prosaic, detailed, and procedural world of the left hemisphere. When infantile amnesia kicks in around 3 years of age, we're destined to slowly lose touch with the memories of earlier experience. But some sense of the magic sacred remains accessible to awareness given the right situations. This figure from a study shows a decline in magical thinking as children mature from age 4 to year 6. So this is the percentage of children reporting, and this is 4 to 6 years. The top bar reports how children act as though magic actually happens. The bottom bar with the decline shows children actually reporting magical experiences. And of course, before 3, it's hard to find out children's verbal reports of what they experience. So we all grow up, and we each carry the memories of years of right hemisphere experience. Unconscious, forgotten to wakeful consciousness, but still present, and I argue still capable of being mobilized by triggering circumstances later into adult life. We see this both personally and clinically. I still remember the sense of monsters lurking behind corners when I was 5 years old if I went to the bathroom. I saw that in my children too. The house was inhabited by strange beings for a while. For my younger daughter, an olive tree had magical powers. She spoke to repeatedly. Many children report the presence of magical companions whose presence and importance fades over time. One patient commented, looking back on our treatment, "You got in there more than most, but the gods were just too powerful." Occasionally, manic episodes are accompanied by powerful religious experiences. In the early stages of the highly dissociated patient I've reported on before, Shelley, she was attacked by visible figures flying around, trying to disrupt the sessions and her growing dangerous attachment to me. So what's the sacred dimension? From this point of view, the religious impulse originates from the early right hemisphere experiences of a child. It's universal. When I personally feel a sense of awe, it's usually when I'm confronted with something much larger than my personal space. Churches and temples, nature itself evokes this feeling. Remember, I was going to a bar mitzvah at the temple in San Francisco where the UN had been, set up, and it was just awesome. I had never felt the sacred so powerfully. I am opened in these situations to a more expansive sense of self, more global, less particular. Remember T.H. Lerman's book, When God Talks Back, where she found that normal subjects trained in fundamentalist prayer practices saw a significant increase in their self-absorption scores, reflecting a weakening sense of the self-other barrier. For them, it became easier to lose the sense of self when they were absorbed in experiences. Particularly gifted prayers reported the experience of Jesus beside them during their everyday experience. Now, let's turn to the issue that I couldn't make any sense of, the issue of sacrifice as universality in religious practices, human and otherwise. I can't get into the thought of killing my kids and eating them. Some cultures could. It's ubiquitous if you go back into prehistory. So there are many theories, but often from a top-down perspective, but let's start with the Abrahamic religions. These all stem, correct me if I'm wrong, from the central myth of Abraham and Isaac. God asked Abraham, "Will you sacrifice your son for me?" But sacrifice goes back to prehistoric times and beyond, widespread across cultures, across the entire world. The common feature seems to be wishes to positively influence the gods or treat the god/king figures well, as in slaying of hundreds of retainers for the god king. In Judaism, animal sacrifice is stopped by the 4th century Common Era. And of course, for Christians, Christ was the ultimate redeemer, whose death was interpreted as the redemption for all mankind of all of their sins. I mean, what a bargain, right? To me, there is an interesting near universal theme that we have all misbehaved in some ways. Personally, I have sinned, may have sinned, done many things wrong as an adult. But are all children born in a state of sin or having to catch up to be even okay? Hardly, I say. Not in my world. So how have we so often been seen as essentially bad? Well, if early universal human infant-child experience is the key to understanding religiosity, how could we look at this issue? Well, one way is through the concept of pathological accommodation, first proposed by another ICP guru, Bernard Brandschaft. In trying to explain the finding that abused infants cling more tightly to their abusers, he postulated that to break the attachment bond to the abuser parent, the infant would face the intolerable threat of self-fragmentation. To quote Brandschaft, systems of pathological accommodation are responses to the trauma of archaic object loss and designed to protect against intolerable pain. To me, it seems fairly obvious that the early emergent self feels and is essentially dependent upon the presence of the parent, and in my language, God. Likewise, from Ronald Fairbairn, not an ICP guru, who coined the term moral defense, came the idea that one of the ways it may survive the presence of what he calls bad object relations, open parentheses, parental trauma, existential trauma, is to employ the moral defense against bad objects. So what's the moral defense? He says, if we experience bad object relations, we cannot stay in this state for too long. As children, we cannot tolerate a situation in which we deem our caregivers as bad, since this would be life-threatening. If they're bad and our life depends upon them, we'd be in big trouble, right? So we solve this dilemma by splitting the badness from the caregiver and become all bad ourselves, thereby making them all good. By bearing the burden of badness, we preserve the idealized good object out there, our parents, and we no longer feel our life is threatened. As I was writing this, I can't help but imagine what it's like for the infants of the recent catastrophic earthquake in Syria and Turkey. From the perspective of Melanie Klein, and maybe other theorists, there's also a developmentally fundamental sense of guilt as the idealized perfect object is replaced by the more integrated shade of gray object of successful normal development. So the idea is the early infant consciousness is intrinsically split into good and bad, maybe pleasure and pain. Infant clings to an ideal, but then that ideal disappears and they blame themselves as they grow into that integrated shade of gray world. So if a God construct is seen as all-powerful and in some ways reactive to human behavior, then harsh or terrible times reinforces the idea of payback for personal sin. Then doing anything, everything to please God is intuitively justified. I can only imagine that early human attempts to right the scales, most importantly, the most intimate precious objects, tribes, animals, calves, human beings, totally pure versions, might most please the gods. Let's get to self-psychology and religion for a moment. Heinz Kohut was interested in the early development and evolution of the sense of self. He identified what he calls self-object experiences, namely those common and yet vital parental functions which promoted the development of a strong, cohesive self. There are basically three. I was going to bring my tripod with the folder, but it seemed like I could just talk about this without that. The approving, mirroring mother, the idealized parental imago, father usually, there's no father later on mother, which provides rules, protection, and values. And lastly, the third, kinship experience, experiencing a shared likeness with others. Now, hopefully, development proceeds from these archaic relationships to more mature self-object experiences, such as, in later life, clubs, professional identity, idealizing and following cultural and political leaders, etc. This also includes religious affiliations, and I suggest that current, particularly Abrahamic religions, provide analogous functions. These functions may be particularly useful for folks in our modern times who need a shoring up of self from an unfortunate early development. Religious fanatics of all stripes may be so absolute in their ideology because they need the intense identification to consolidate and maintain their sense of self. In my respect, think of Trump's case. Remember Brandshaft, infants cling to parental figures because to detach would risk self-fragmentation. Clearly, you don't have to be ill to be religious. I'll say that again. You don't have to be ill to be religious. But I think there's a sort of comfort for most folks in the common practice, particularly sense of belonging to a like community. I would argue that most current religions are persistent and helpful for adherents, and believers because they provide useful self-object functions. First, an idealized leader with venerated followers, offering a rich source of values and ideals to guide one's life. Second, a sense of personal worth and value from following the right path, Caucasian mirroring. And third, a sense of likeness and community. All this is valid and useful self-glue, I would say. The power differential between leader and followers may also evoke and be triggered or be sustained by the triggering of long walled-off and forgotten aspects of early childhood experience when all powerful parents come into focus. Practices such as prayer, likewise, they invite early qualities of consciousness, particularly those of repetition or those which evoke trance states. I'm almost done. Special structures with icons and beautiful imagery that evokes awe, they do the same. And notice that priests are called father figures, you know, not to bedevil Catholicism. So my suggestion is that some of the emotional power of religion may stem from settings and practices that evoke aspects of walled-off childhood experience. Walled off, but still there, unconscious, powerfully useful and emotionally convincing to the believer or follower. Even as a relatively secular fellow, when I'm in a church or temple, unfamiliar emotions emerge, powerful enough to be a bit unsettling and difficult to put into standard language. And again, this postulated right hemisphere early rest of consciousness is pre-verbal, you know. Religions also offer past pictures of miracles, magical events which reveal the spiritual credentials of the founders. Religions may have evolved, like civilization, from early, now only dimly glimpsed cultures. Cultures immersed in the sacred and magical power of the gods. Cultures not yet dominated by left hemisphere entrapment. So the circuit may be real, carried along with every person, waiting to be evoked under special circumstances. Many, for instance, Ken Wilber, have argued that we can discern a progressive positive evolution of our consciousness. I hope he's right. My fear is that political agendas will hijack religions, and our current and past experience documents that this happens, is happening today, and happened too many times before. Last paragraph. Some argue that intensive therapy like analysis works by promoting a therapeutic regression. I think that's probably true. It's so, 5 times a week, opening up aspects of early experience that otherwise would be inaccessible. Atwood was prescient when he told therapists that we are gods to our patients. Perhaps religion can do the same. So that's the end of my presentation. Some questions now, would you like to go into?
I don't know what
Maybe
questions now about
now.
this. Yeah.
For now.
Yeah. I think have some questions now.
Okay.
So did you think about the possibility of a so-called, I guess, mature religion, which is not based on walled-off childhood experiences? It might, in a sense, go beyond that, fulfilling that unmet need. Did you wonder how to sort of make sense of that?
Well, I thought of that, but in that I was looking at religion across all of known human history, and that
No one's got there yet, basically.
well, we'd have to argue about what's mature, right?
Yes.
We hope that what we're doing is the most mature, but in terms of just God constructs, there are probably 30,000 or more gods out there in our past, and they were all worshipped with a sense of empowerment and religiosity. And, this is a downer, but I thought if there were really only one God struck, why would he wait so long to let us know the true path? So, in thinking about the whole scope, I didn't think about the ideal of a totally mature religion. In Kohut's framework from archaic to mature self-objects, you have that movement, that development movement, which I think is really important. I mean, as a side note, a lot of Asian religions work on the idea of waking up, whereas the more Abrahamic and other religions are growing up. And in that sense, mature religion is more with the growing up vision.
Okay.
I like the idea of growing up, also.
Evolving.
Evolving. But I mean, that's really an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, whether over time, look at that in the broadest of strokes, in spite of the mishaps and mayhem and pillaging, there is an evolution of human, foundational consciousness.
In like the ultra orthodox, don't look past the ancient. They're not, doing what Abraham did to Isaac, but they are. Some of them do the chicken.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we said they have some of the greatest minds of the 15th century.
Yes. You know more than I do about this evolution, because,
Well, there's a little bit of a sacrifice, right?
huh?
There's a little bit of a sacrifice. Yeah.
I really liked what you were saying about the right hemisphere. I think something about as being the seat of the soul. I don't think those were your words, but where unconsciousness resides. And there's a book I made a little bit of headway about. The right hemisphere is the master, actually, and the left is sort of a tag along, which I think are totally different.
Is that the McGillicuddy book? Leon McGillicuddy, The Master and His Emissary?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a woman, European woman, I think. Get that in my head. But also, I was thinking of, I said Christopher Bolas, you would notice the aesthetic object, the overwhelm of the mother, who is so radiant in a way that it is almost impossible to take in. And, the small child, baby, whatever, has to contend with that overwhelming experience, and you're locating God there. It's very interesting.
And I suppose you'd say that the child never gets to that place. The overwhelmingly perfect aesthetic object, we always fail at emulating that, so it kind of reinforces your idea, Jim. You'll seek something else to.
But development wrests us away from that relatively differentiated sense. The self-object construct involves a certain blurring of self and other. You kind of become the same in narcissistic terms. There is a book called The Master and His Emissary by Leon McGilchrist, which is a 500-page, terribly difficult to read book where he argues what I've argued, that there is an evolution of, early consciousness is informed by right hemisphere, largely sensations, they come through the right hemisphere, then it's handed over to the emissary, the left hemisphere, and ideally we want to get to a place where both qualities of consciousness are available to us, maybe the frontal lobe. So, it's a good book.
The
Yeah,
Master
great.
and His Emissary, I think that is the book I was reading, actually.
Really? It's
What's
really,
that
really
something?
thick,
Is emissary?
very
The
dense.
Master,
Yes.
it's written by a
Master
woman.
and His Emissary.
I got it.
Master as emissary?
And His Emissary.
Master and His
Leon,
Emissary.
L-I-A-N, McGilchrist.
Okay, and his emissary?
We'll pop right up on Amazon.
Yeah, right.
I can't help thinking about the people who worshipped the sun and how that doesn't seem so primitive to me.
Does not seem so primitive.
Right.
Keeps coming back.
Or the moon.
Well, but given that without the sun there would be nothing. And, I think of the Egyptians, and also I was recently at Sedona, Arizona, where the sun is you know, all the depictions of the pictographs about, or the sun, and there's some wisdom in that, it seems to me.
Well, if you think of Piaget's developmental theories, object constancy takes a while to develop.
Yeah.
If you don't have object constancy, you can't count on the sun coming up
Yeah.
every day, so you're really in the thick of it, and you might as well pray for it,
Exactly.
you know, from my point of view.
Yeah, interesting.
And it's.
Ian, I can't help but think about psychedelics. You mentioned that you were into psychedelics at a former time of your life, and that undifferentiated that you brought up
Mhm.
in religious experience and the possibility of the stoned ape theory.
Well, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I've talked to people a fair amount about that.
Mm.
I was the victim of being given acid in medical settings as a medical student to get paid, and nothing too much happened. But I think it can be argued that psychedelics tap into right hemisphere experience, deep layers of experience where maybe there's some Jungian archetypes, you know, running around. It's interesting to me in thinking about this, that set and setting is so important, because if it's related to hypnosis, hypnotizability, people are very suggestive. You know, so there may be some linkage there. I'll be happy to be here for the psychedelic experience discussion.
Experience maybe too.
Experience. With my greatest friend back in the day, I experimented, and we spent a couple of days listening to Gregorian chants, and then since I had, in my experiments, forgotten what happened, I tape recorded it, and I came to something that was so meaningful. I never decided to take acid again, and that was a sense of some outpouring, radiant, golden, something I called the cosmic break. And there was this incredible feeling that to go back to ordinary gym, but all the pieces will fit together, you know, in some way. Everything will be reconciled. And, you know, blow me away. It took me 6 months to outlive that experience. And for the first time in my life, I had the sense that if I were to die, it would all be okay. And also greatly diminished the sexual attraction. So that slowly wore off. And I decided it could never be better for me.
Oh, thank you for sharing
Yeah,
that.
that's a beautiful experience.
Wow.
I'm honored to have had it.
We're talking about religion, but I found out late that I was Jewish and had that experience with it where it was a puzzle piece. And when I came to see you, it was like, here I am. And I don't know if it was right or left brain or anything, but this had been going on since I was a little girl. And to find it out, it was like, I don't know what it was. These books, Rick had these books. But it's the same sort of thing. It's, okay, now I can die.
Yeah, how fulfilling.
It was glorious,
Yeah.
you know, here I am.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say something, but we have a schedule.
I'll be quiet.
Yeah, we do have another speaker or so.
Okay, well, it's hard not to follow, but that's why I wanted
Thank
you to
you,
go
Jim.
first, because I
Yeah.
thought you would really open us up to the, I don't know, the luminousness of the subject, which you did, thank you. Profound.